That I'm a couple minutes late today, although it looks like attendance is exceedingly low today. That's okay. Um, hey, Jacob. Nice to see you. Sorry I'm a bit late. ¿Qué pasó? Something weird happened. It's not, the camera's not working. Strange. Ah. Ah. Hey, Jacob.
Hello.
All right. I think I hit the wrong button. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Fine. Sorry that I'm very disorganized today. I was in Dallas last night. Okay, here we go. Y'all, we're going to have a couple of presentations today. Or at least one. We might have two. Very excited about Bonaventure. I'm also very impressed with any student who's going to write their paper on Bonaventure. Wow. I mean, I think it's weird. I think it would be easier to write on Thomas. So very excited about that. Before I call Mason up to give his presentation, I want to do something real quick because here we are near the end of the semester, and y'all, I will try my hardest by Monday to try to learn something about the final exam and put that up on Canvas. Okay. Your final exam will be 15 multiple choice questions, and I'm going to give you I'm going to give them to you on the last day of class. Yeah, you're welcome. But I don't know when it is. You'll take it on Zoom. You'll have 2 hours to take it on Zoom. I don't know when it is. If you have a conflict during those 2 hours, we'll work something out. I will email it to you, and you'll have 2 hours to get it back to me. But I don't know when that 2-hour window is. Okay, and I will try to make progress on that over the weekend. But before I call Mason up for his presentation, I wanted to say, because here we are near the end of the semester, and if you are someone who has found this class interesting, I want to just say a couple things. So first off, this is slightly embarrassing, but I'm gonna pull something up off my blog. If you're someone who's found this class interesting and you're thinking to yourself, I like this stuff, then perhaps you want to continue to learn about stuff like this. This right here is a really awesome podcast. See, radical orthodoxy is a theological movement that's very contemporary that I happen to be into. Now, you don't have to like it, but you might. This is an awesome podcast.
When I was studying, nobody really thought theology was an important subject.
Because medieval philosophy is almost the same as theology, and it might even be the same. So I wanted to show you that. This is a wonderful podcast. I'll go ahead and put this on Canvas. Yeah. Radical orthodoxy is a wonderful thing. It is a theological movement. How do you do that? Is it an announcement? Should I have done an announcement? Maybe. I think I should have done an announcement. I wanted to bring radical orthodoxy to your attention and just mention it because if you're someone who's found this class interesting, I think you'll really like that. I also wanted to point out two other things. One is, you might remember a video that we watched. It was a short video on Thomas Aquinas. but the why study videos are really, really good. They're connected to the University of Nottingham in the UK, and I highly recommend them. It's not just Thomas Aquinas, there's lots of other ones. So why study Bonaventure? Same deal. Bonaventure, yeah. I should have done YouTube. There we go. So these are really, really good. Really, really good. They're connected with Nottingham University. I'll say one last thing, and that is an author that I really like and would recommend, and was reading him yesterday. His name is David Bentley Hart. Highly recommend him. He has some YouTube videos as well, but these are some of his books that all shall be saved. This book right here, The Experience of God, has changed many people's lives, including some people who were undergraduates here and are now studying theology. This is his first big book, The Beauty of the Infinite. Highly recommended. So for example, and he's taught me a lot. So like, for example, this business about how God for the medievals is not a thing in the world, but rather but being itself, the ground of being. I learned a lot of that stuff from David Bentley Hart. I mean, he's channeling the authentic thought of people like Thomas Aquinas, but David Bentley Hart is awesome. I just wanted to mention that. This book, The Beauty of the Infinite, The Aesthetics of Christian Truth, is amazing. Yeah, okay. I just wanted to say some things about that. The semester's ending. Maybe you found this class more interesting than you expected. And so if that's true, then I wanted to recommend some of those things. And by the way, let me say that if y'all would, if there's anyone who wanted to get together outside of class and say, listen to that podcast and discuss it, I would be willing to do that. And if you're 21 or older, I might even be willing to supply some beverage. But I will leave that ball in your court. You can pursue it if you want. And at this time, I would like to invite Mason to come forward and to talk to us about Saint Bonaventure. And Mason, as I said, I'm just going to leave this lapel mic here next to you so that hopefully it'll pick up your voice.
Alrighty, well, so I'm going to give a brief presentation on St. Bonaventure, with more specifically a kind of focus of what I'm going to be talking about during my essay.
Can I say something real quick? If you don't want to say Saint Bonaventure or Saint Thomas Aquinas, you don't have to. I mean, it's a habit that I have. Don't feel like you have to do that. If you want to, great. Don't do it. Don't feel like you have to, and certainly don't do it for me. But so, thank you.
Okay, so just kind of a general outline of what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to give a kind of basic overview of who St. Bonaventure was, some interesting ideas, then go into kind of the topic of my paper. So Bonaventure, as already mentioned, was in this class, was a Franciscan theologian. And what's really interesting about St. Bonaventure is that his philosophy is not distinct from his theology, in which that there's no real work that he produced that actually only addresses philosophical concepts. You kind of see there's a few writings of Thomas Aquinas where he writes commentaries on Aristotle, or he'll kind of address just purely philosophical concepts. But Bonaventure only kind of writes in very theological terms. And one of St. Bonaventure's most famous ideas is a proof for God that we haven't really addressed. We talked about the 5 ways the other day about of Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, but another proof for God that Bonaventure lays out. He also has the ontological argument and the cosmological argument, but another argument that he lays out is the argument of illumination, in which he conceptualizes it as the mind that seeks out God. The mind, as it seeks out knowledge, searches for God's being, and the cause of the mind's knowledge is from God. So when we try to find knowledge, when we try to find certainty, we aren't just searching for some just like objects in the world. We aren't just like looking at properties and kind of systematizing them, but rather the kind of root of our drive towards knowledge is a lack, you could say, in our minds, in our knowledge, in which we continue to strive for God. Now, as Professor Bolter did mention, that Bonaventure is a very difficult thinker to kind of get your mind around, simply because of that non-distinction between his philosophy and theology, at least personally for me, in which that I would need a lot more background in theological concepts and theological debates at the time, and really to situate him within his historical lineage to really grasp his theological project in totality. But so the way that I tried to approach this paper is try to find something that I've been curious about, and then to see what St. Bonaventure talks about. And what I've been really trying to think about in this class is the being that God has. Previously, before this class, I would say that I kind of aligned more with the bad guys, as you mentioned in one of the lectures, in which that there was where I kind of supported a kind of generic being, conception of being. I had some questions about how we could define being as another entity that has being. Those were my kind of questions. So I decided to try to figure out more specifically about what kind of being God has, to hopefully get me into St. Bonaventure's kind of mindset towards being and towards God. And one of the biggest philosophical concepts around God's being is the conception of divine simplicity, in which the attributes of God are identical with God himself. So God is wise, God is omnipotent, God is good, and these attributes aren't simply just things that God has access to, but rather these attributes are God in himself, which I would say provides me with a little bit of confusion, coming with the kind of pure being understanding, that how could we say that being is good, because we're already presupposing that kind of relationship of being towards these types of attributes. So I'm trying to kind of parcel that out. And the place that I found that where Bonaventure most specifically addresses the kind of idea of divine simplicity is in his commentary of the Sentences. And the Sentences are a group of books authored by Peter Lombard in the 12th century, in which that they're a collection of glosses, which is like scripture and commentary from things of the Bible, in which that there were kind of, it was theological doctrine that was authored by like Augustine and the church fathers, that were all kind of compiled into one book.
Authorities.
Yeah, authorities. It's an authoritative text. And in fact, Bonaventure was a lecturer of this book at the University of Paris when he taught there. So I thought that would probably give me an access to what Bonaventure really thought about divine simplicity. And at least in the text, I don't know if this is a universal. I'm not sure if the work that I found was not like the universal form that these writings took, but the form in which that the book that I found, in which that Bonaventure lays out his conception of divine simplicity, starts with a few arguments as to why God is simple in the highest degree. It provides counter arguments, and then Bonaventure responds to those arguments in the text. And for this presentation, I'm only going to really talk about why God is simple in the highest degree. He breaks it down into further other questions, sort of like the Summa Theologica of Aquinas, in which he asks a few questions, and this is just God is simple in the highest degree. So he has a few arguments as to reasons why God is simple. The first argument is that the first in a series must be simple, because nothing can be prior, simply because there's nothing prior, there's nothing that after something happens, more complexity happens after the first thing. Since God is the creator, God is the first thing, there can't be something more complicated after him because he's the creator. There's nothing more simple. The second argument is that everything that is what it has is simple to the highest degree, and God is what he has. So we can either conceptualize God is his power or God is not his power. But we're not simply, but when we talk about God, we don't talk about that God is wise because he is taking some part of wisdom in the kind of abstract and he possesses some form of wisdom. But rather, God is what he has. He is wisdom. He is goodness. The third argument is the argument for perfection, in which simplicity is a condition for being perfect, in which if something was complicated, it wouldn't be perfect, let's say. So I think he gives the example of like a task in which multiple things accomplish one goal. That wouldn't be as perfect as one thing accomplishing one task, because each thing there wouldn't meet the threshold to accomplishing that task. So you have to be simple to be perfect. And the fourth and final argument is that simple things are stronger than complex things, in which power, a unified power can do more than a diverse power. And this, I think this is kind of empirically proven, at least this philosophical abstract is grounded in abstraction from empirics. Like, for example, a disunified army would be a lot worse than a unified army attacking one single foe. So in just the same way, if God was simple, he would be stronger, he would have more power. And since God is omnipotent and God is perfect, he would have perfect power, he would have to be simple. So a few of the counter arguments that he lays out, which I found very interesting, because a lot of the counter arguments necessarily are not raised from kind of like a atheist skeptic sort of way, but rather are kind of grounded in the theological tradition in which that they pull from scripture. One of the counter arguments, to give a basic preview, necessarily talks about how God is necessarily broken up into three beings: the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. How do we kind of rectify that with God's simplicity? So a few of the counter arguments, just to kind of give a brief synopsis. The first one is that simple is the abstraction for many things. Since God is many things, he's good, he's wise, he's powerful. He's not simple because he's a lot of things. The second argument is that the greatest simplicity is where there's identity without diversity. And with God, there is identity with diversity, with the supposits. And the supposits are things that are underneath God. The third one is that greater simplicity with unity without polarity there's greater simplicity with unity without plurality. And since God is numbered, there are three forms of God. I don't know if that's the right word, but since these numbers would necessarily imply complexity. The fourth argument is that properties are necessarily different in God, that wisdom is not the same as goodness. Power is not the same as wisdom. These things are all necessarily distinct. And so he gives a few responses to these arguments. So the first response to how simple is merely just an abstraction, he argues that what is one in many things, without being multiple is the most simple. Since God is in all things without being multiplied, God is simpler than he was just one thing or multiple things. So, for example, we can say that God is one thing. We can say that God is three things. But the most simple and the greatest would necessarily be if God kept his being, kept his simplicity across multiple things. That would be the most simple, most perfect. The second response about how there's greater simplicity when there's identity without diversity Bonaventure argues that there's diversity in two ways. Either we can have addition or from origin. And since the Son is not so much an addition to God, that there's no real contradiction here. So if we were to say that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit were all additions to God, they were all distinct things from one another, that would be from addition. That would not be simple. But rather, since they all emanate from the same kind of divine being, there's no addition there. They're all from the same origin. The third response, in which there's greater simplicity with unity without plurality, Bonaventure argues that there are two kinds of plurality. There are more in two than in one, or there's just as much. So, for example, if there are two guys, both of them would be good. There'd be greater goodness in two guys than one guy that was doing one thing. But since God is distinct from just like single things, it would be necessarily greater. So basically, God plus God is still God. Like there's no addition there if we were to add God, as we would have if plurality would necessarily be a kind of addition.
Quick question. Am I correct in thinking that this third phase of the discussion, are you with me so far?
Mm-hmm.
That this is Bonaventure's actual view, or at least the best way to determine what his view is?
Yes, I think that in combination with the first section, in which he kind of lays out his arguments, and the third section, where he responds to critics, would be the distillation of divine simplicity. And to finish up about how properties are necessarily different in God, Bonaventure does the classic scholastic move in which he says that properties differ in three ways. First, in relation to subjects, in relation to each other, or in relation to objects. And the third is what God has, that God has one power, but God actualizes those attributes to different objects. So, for example, goodness and wisdom, they are not so much distinct properties, but rather the different articulations of God's being towards different objects, like knowledge or like ethics. That's how God would differ. So my paper, to sum up, will be to fully articulate Bonaventure's articulation of what's God's being. And since God is simple, I want to get deeper on that.
Amen. Please. Some questions and comments. Thank you so much. Okay, the main question I have is, did you find an English translation of Bonaventure's sentences commentary?
Yeah.
Do you happen to see there's 4 books of Peter Lombard's sentences, and so there's usually 4 books of the commentaries.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find all 4 books in English?
Yeah.
What?
I found them online as PDFs.
I bet they're very new. Yeah. That's pretty cool. I mean, that's great. Good to know.
Mm-hmm.
I could not find English translations of his sentences commentary. Which would have been helpful. I mean, I know Latin in theory, but time is scarce.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay. Very good.
I could email you the
yeah.
ones that I found.
If you would do that, that'd be awesome.
Okay.
So a couple of other points. Okay. So the notion of a proof for, or I think you said a proof for illumination. Perhaps you meant, or I think you said an argument for illumination. Perhaps you meant an argument from illumination.
Yeah, I think that's what I meant.
And you may have said that. I could be wrong. But so it's interesting. I mean, I haven't read the sentences commentary very much at all. But I've read him talk about divine illumination a lot. And yeah, I, I just want to register the fact that I think my sense is that that's not an argument for God's existence in the normal sense or the way that say we looked at with Thomas Aquinas and his 5 ways.
Mhm.
It's way more subtle. It's not like there's premises that lead to a conclusion. I would suggest in Bonaventure. I mean, first off, he normally doesn't even argue that way, although he does more in the Sentences commentary than other texts that he wrote. That's true, but still, I don't think it's like an argument like premises and then a conclusion. And it's partly because you just can't argue from divine illumination that way. I mean, divine illumination for Bonaventure is a condition. It's a condition for the possibility of blank. What is blank? Blank could be knowledge of anything at all. Knowledge of anything at all. So divine illumination is a necessary condition for knowing anything at all for Bonaventure. And it's very related to the first segment of Plato's line. And it's also related to natural reason, creation day 1. And so, for example, if you think of the statement, the whole is greater than the part. The whole is greater than any one part. You can see how that statement is obviously true, right? And it's irrefutably true. You couldn't argue against that. And we know that for Bonaventure because of divine illumination. Anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. Do you have anything that you want to say about that?
Would you say that it would say that he, like, I don't want to, I mean, this is medieval to modern, but almost like a proto Kantian move?
I would.
In which he kind of says that there's a, let's say, rotary motion, that there's a lack that we have that impels us towards knowledge. And he says that what is this lack striving towards? There has to be an object there.
I mean, it sounds like you've grappled with Kant and wrapped your mind. You've hung your hat on some pegs in your understanding of Kant that have been helpful to you, and that's awesome. You lost me a little bit about the rotary motion stuff, but I just think that yes, I mean, even this language condition for the possibility of X is sort of Kantian language. So yes, I think the answer is yes. Now, I wanted to say a couple of other things. First off, this idea God is what God has. Yeah. By the way, that's kind of like our bodies. Like a lot of this stuff, like when you're looking at the medievals and reading the medievals and considering what they think, that we have this temptation and it's a tendency just immediately it sort of sounds stupid. Like I think we're sort of biased against it, but I think that the more you think about it, you're like, holy shit, that might actually be true. And I think this is a good example of that. I mean, God is what God has. What? That seems so stupid if it's even intelligible. But think about your own body. I mean, I would argue that Jacob has a body, but also Jacob is a body. And so in that sense, Jacob is what Jacob has. You know what I mean? So I just think that that's kind of an interesting analogy there. I wanted to talk a little bit about this notion of being as a genus or generic being. I actually have a blog post. It's embarrassing, but I do have a blog post, and I think it's really good about a generic being. And one modern philosopher who, I mean, most modern people, and really people from like Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, who were Franciscans, in other words, they were sort of like Bonaventure's children. Most people, beginning with them onwards, do think that genus is a being is a genus. Mhm. Now, Thomas Aquinas does not think that. He thinks that being is God, and God is not a genus. So you know what we mean by genus, right? It's like the Charles Linnaeus stuff, right? Like the animal kingdom, phylum, blah blah blah. This stuff. Oh, come on. This type of stuff, right? This is literally what we mean by genus and species. So a genus is like a universal cat. It's universal. What does universal mean? It means that it's not particular. So a class or a category is universal. It's generic. That's what we mean by species. A species is a class. It's like a mammal. And it's not like you might want to say, oh no, mammal is an order or a no, forget about all that. All of these are species. When you're talking about philosophy, it just means general class, okay? And most people have thought that being is a genus. And in particular, this dude, Gilles Deleuze, who's an amazing philosopher, thought that being was generic. I don't really think we have time to talk about this because it could be very dense. But what people like Deleuze thinks is that, you know, you've got classes of things. You have objects. So you can have like 3 cups and 3 markers. But you can come up with a broader class. Let's call it thing. So thing would be a species or a class that's broader than cup or marker, right? And what people like Deleuze thinks is that you can just keep going up and getting more and more general until you get to being. If God is being, then obviously that doesn't work because God is not. If God is real, God is not a class. God is not a universal category. What is God? Well, that's a different topic, but God is not a class, okay? So I just wanted to say that about generic being. That's really cool that you talked about that. Many people would argue that Bonaventure, like the people that I introduced you to at the beginning of the class, like this radical orthodoxy movement, this David Bentley Hart guy, they tend to say that Bonaventure was the first person in history to begin to think that way. And they regard that as a pernicious movement. In other words, it's a negative development. In other words, they think that Bonaventure is kind of a bad guy. I'm not sure I agree with them, and I'm not sure I'm smart enough to figure it out. It's really difficult. Yes?
What was the pernicious idea exactly?
That being is a genus.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that being is a genus. See, Thomas Aquinas thinks that being is analogical. Analogical. We don't have time to talk about it right now. But at the very beginning of Aristotle's metaphysics, he says being is said or spoken in different ways. And so it's very complicated. I don't think we have time to talk about it, but the rest of the categories is Aristotle saying, here's 9 different ways of being. One of those 9 different ways of being he calls substance. But so Aristotle thinks that there's 9 categories of being, and they're irreducible to one another. If they're irreducible to one another, then being cannot be a genus. Because if being is a genus, then things can be reduced down to that genus. Okay, so I just wanted to say that. I hope that's interesting and helpful. I want to say one thing about the sentences commentaries, because every every master in the medieval university was required to lecture on the sentences, aka required to write a sentences commentary. The sentences of Peter Lombard was like, it became the standard theology textbook for the university up until the Reformation. I mean, even Martin Luther wrote a sentences commentary. And it's super interesting for many regards Um, one of the things that I was going to say before Mason's talk is that really this is coming off of my last Bonaventure lecture. If I held a gun to your head and said, what are the two most important developments in the thought of Aquinas and Bonaventure both, or you could say the 13th century, what are the two biggest developments? The answer would be the rise of the evangelical poverty movement, right? Mendicant orders, St. Francis, St. Dominic, the rise of the evangelical poverty movement, that's one. But then secondly, the rediscovery of Aristotle would be the second one. And with the rediscovery of Aristotle, you get this move toward scholasticism away from what Jean Leclerc calls monastic forms of writing. And things get more scientific. Well, the sentences play into that as well. The sentences of Peter Lombard, because he introduces all sorts of innovations into Western thought, like things like tables of contents. You might think that a table of contents isn't any big whoop, but actually it's a movement toward a kind of systematization that ended up pushing thought in the direction of system and therefore science, scientia. So the sentences commentaries are super important and super interesting. I'm glad to know that it's translated into English now because it wasn't 18 months ago. Some of it was, but much of it wasn't. Yeah, a simple being is perfect. A simple being is perfect. I just want to register the fact that, see, I talk about divine simplicity a lot. I think that it sort of unlocks the history of thought in the West in really helpful ways. And I emphasize the notion of negation. Divine simplicity is sort of the result of negative theology. God is not this, God is not this, God is not this, God is not this. Well, they're really double negations because what's being negated is already finite. And so, in other words, this marker is finite, not just because it's not infinite, meaning it doesn't stretch that way forever and that way forever, but it's also finite because it has parts and wholes, okay? The notion of parts and wholes indicates relationships of dependence. So you see, the marker is finite. And when we say that God is not composite, which is a way of saying that God has no parts, what we're negating is something that's already finite. So it's a double negation. And I just wanted to register that. The statement, a simple being is perfect, presupposes the notion of finite being. And just, I'll say one more thing about this. I'm in danger of not being helpful here, but Bonaventure and Thomas Aquinas get a lot of this from a medieval guy named Avicenna. 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 That's the Latinization of his name. He was a Muslim thinker, very important. We've talked a little bit about Averroes. The other big medieval Muslim thinker is Avicenna. And yeah. Did you want to say something, Michael?
Is he the guy that introduced a lot of Aristotle to the scholastics?
Yes, he and Averroes both. Remember, the commentator with a capital C is Averroes. And so Averroes and Avicenna differ. They have a lot of disagreements, but they both love Aristotle and they're both super important. And they both pissed off the Muslim priests. I guess they're called imams. In other words, they were regarded in the Muslim religious community as being sort of like secular or liberal or something like that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And yeah, simple things are stronger than complex things. Yeah. Have you ever, I mean, you even alluded to this with your analogy of like the military or an army or something like that. Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard the phrase divide and conquer? if something is simple, it can't be divided, and therefore it can't be conquered. You know? So if you want to defeat someone, or let's say you want to destroy a family, divide them, introduce divisions into the family, and you will conquer them. I mean, that's what Russia and Putin try to do to the United States. They're wanting to polarize us so that they can conquer us. You know what I mean? So good. That's all I got. Good job. Super exciting. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Any other questions for Mason? Sorry, I should have asked. Are y'all doing okay? Good, good, good. We have about 15 more minutes. That was very good. I am going to continue to, oh, I was wondering. Come on up. Good, 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 good. Thank you for saying that. And that's what I thought. And sorry for forgetting.
I have a PowerPoint as well.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Be sure to share your screen. You know how to do that? Do you know how to work Zoom?
Not that well.
Yeah.
Share screen. Oh, here we go. Share screen.
Good job.
Is that it?
Yep.
I have a flash drive.
Yeah.
Is there a?
Do what you need to do.
Suppose I'll have that.
It's not possible to email it to yourself.
I did do that too.
You did?
Let's see.
I don't suppose you copied me on the email, did you? Oh, there you go. If anyone would like to help Michael,
Click on the file
you're more than welcome.
at the bottom toolbar,
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's right.
and then it'll be on the left. It's, is it USB? Yeah, so go to the left.
The column on the left.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Oh, that's right. I see it. Yeah. Okay, great.
You might also need to click the blue share button on Zoom.
Okay.
It's hard, isn't it? Like, dude, I'm like trying to talk and give a lecture while doing all that shit. It is hard. May I help you? Did you share it
I
already?
think so. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Awesome.
And then there's,
Thank you. Are you wanting to make it big?
I'm just wanting to just start this.
I'll show you. I know how to do that. Are you wanting
Oh, sorry.
to? So sadly, this stupid thing is in the way. Go away.
Okay. All right, great.
Yeah, and then just, you can use the arrows.
Okay, great. Okay, so Bonaventure is, I think, really well exemplifies a lot of the scholastic or just more simply just like the medieval philosopher because of his because of all the things that he was able to reconcile. He was sort of in the monastic tradition of being very compassionate in the way that he would sort of have these writings of God, but then also he was very organized and very scholastic. He also was able to reconcile this sort of poverty movement, but then also he was able to reconcile that with wanting a very maybe more scientific or maybe more disciplined way of examining theology and also exploring just truth. And what I'm really interested in is his epistemology, his understanding of the Trinity, his exploration of the simplicity of God and the mystery behind that, and then also his similarities to Plato. He's very similar to Plato in a lot of ways, but it's interesting because he seems to have a little bit of a different approach to as far as knowledge. So those are some of the things I want to go into. He has these kind of talking about some of the things Mason was talking about. there's essentially the mystery of the simplicity of God is just overwhelming, and it's uncanny how how it's similar to how Plato and his sun is. It's like the sun illuminates the world, but we can't see the sun. You know, we can and even the string of negations is a futile device to describe the simplicity of God, because the saying that God is not something it just contains it contains finite things. So, like for example, if you say, okay, God is infinite, you're saying he's also simultaneously not finite. So you're saying that he's not something, and or you're saying that he's but he's everything, sort of simultaneously. I suppose he's not us. In other words, like I am not God. You know, I am a creation of God. But simply put, it's just exceedingly mysterious, and it's difficult to get. So it's like, okay, so then what's the theory for knowledge? So one big motif with Bonaventure is mystical experience and divine intervention. And so this is a tool. There's another tool, and it relates to Plato and Plato's allegory of the cave, knowing knowing what's beyond being is how Plato put it, and that's the form of the good in Plato's terms.
Yeah, and it's right after the line where he says that.
Yeah. So okay, so I'm going to kind of come back a little bit. So let's see here. One tool that Bonaventure uses that I think Plato fails to. Plato actually kind of admitted, and a lot of people were like, why do you think this? And I found myself thinking that all the time when I'd read his stuff. It's like, okay, we reincarnate and you know everything whenever you're a soul, but then when you have your meat prison, you know, you forget everything, and then you have this illusion of learning things, but really you're just remembering things that you lost, information that you lost. And it's like, that's a neat idea, but it's like, why do you think that? And he's just like, I don't know, I just think that. You know? and so it's like, okay, and then what's even weirder is then like St. Augustine later is like, you know, this guy from a long time ago, he wrote that down, and you know, I think that's it. I think he's got it. You know, it's like, why? And it's like, well, we don't know why. And it's like, okay, so just by virtue of someone writing something down, you know, particularly, you know, a pagan, you know, it's like, why? It just didn't make any sense to me. Bonaventure has illuminated some of this. One big tool is the divine intervention. Simply put, you know, God talks to you directly. Another one, though, is the vestiges. So let's see here. Both Bonaventure and Plato talk about the physical world. Plato kind of has a sort of a negative. So he seems disdainful. You know, in the allegory of the cave, there are just these like shadows or whatever, and it's like they're just shadows of artifacts, and it's just such a dismal and insufficient rendering of the true reality. Whereas in the Franciscan tradition, Bonaventure seems to really appreciate and love the animals and his surroundings, and he also refers to them as shadows, but he also refers to them as like vestiges of knowing truth. He calls them the let's see, what is it? The ladder to, it's vestiges or ladders on which we can climb to God. So this is again Plato's line. So this is the starting point where we can get onto the lock onto the images, but then we have this next ability. So we, like the animals, can have sensory perception and have this sort of experience. But then we have the this capacity to to think and reflect on these things. And so it's kind of simple in a way. It's like, well, we see something, we think about it, then we have some sort of a conclusion. And that's what this is. And what's interesting about Bonaventure even further is that what he's saying is that, like sensory perception, we have these so we have maybe perhaps, you know, hardware and software. So we have this like software that's also innately installed in us that allows us to perceive certain things. And then further, he believes in direct divine guidance or supervision as we engage with these vestiges. So we see these vestiges. We have this will and we have this capacity that's innate within us to engage with these and reflect upon them. And then we have this divine intervention, this divine supervision that sort of helps us reach the epiphany. And then from the epiphany, there's the ecstasy or whatever. So
What do you think of that?
it's interesting, and it also reminds me of it's reminding me of it reminds me of Kant and of Descartes a little bit. It seems like a predecessor to some of these ideas, perhaps. So so these are the sort of things that I'm interested in with Bonaventure. So he's a biographer of Saint Francis of Assisi. He's a reconciler of tense ideologies, and then he in doing so is able to create an epistemological theory for ideas that go back to Plato. So let's see here.
By that, do you mean divine illumination? Like
Yes.
illumination theory? Is that what you mean by epistemological theory?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and the vestiges, Plato's line, and divine intervention, and even I think even with while you're thinking about it, I think Bonaventure is saying that, and I'll show you why I think that. But also, I just wanted to talk about the Bonaventure as a person. So this is kind of a map of like where he's from in relation to Rome. It's called Bonaregio. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Magnoregio.
Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's born roughly in there's some debate on when he was born, but they think 1217. And Bonaventure wasn't his original name. He became very sick as a child, and he credits, even though despite the fact that he didn't meet Francis of Assisi, who was the leader of the Franciscan order, he credits his efforts to his survival of some illness that was very, and so this is something, I think this is something like, this seemed to really impact him and maybe inspire him in his career as a religious thinker. And so I think that that's noteworthy and worth kind of pointing out. This is actually the city itself, and I also wanted to kind of show how, where you can see Rome here. We have the Holy Roman Empire to the north, you have the Papal States, then you have the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies to the south. This is just sort of like the political entities that were occupying Italy, the Italian Peninsula in the day. Okay, I also kind of wanted to sketch out sort of a timeline of of major ideological contributors and this development of some of this thought. So, and it's quite a long time. We see Plato died in 348 BC. Plotinus, perhaps like the chief Neoplatonist expert, something like that. You have 270 AD, quite a stretch. We don't even have the Council of Nicaea until 325. Before the Council of Nicaea, you used to have Arian Christians who sort of had a totally radical, different understanding of the Trinity, and they sort of thought of Jesus as maybe a little bit lesser than God the Father, but that's sort of an extinct. But anyway, the point is that Plotinus and a lot of these thinkers were quite early.
They were quite what?
Quite early, quite young. Then we have a pseudo. We're a little unclear on when Pseudo Dionysius, the Areopagite. He's kind of nebulous. Then we have St. Augustine, of course. Giacomo Fiore was kind of an interesting character, and his movement sort of explains the context in which Francis of Assisi and Bonaventure interacted with the church and a lot of the religious community. Giacomo Fiore had this idea of history in these three ages, and it also wraps up with the Trinity. So simply put, he thought that there's the age of God the Father, and that's sort of the Old Testament. Then there's and that's sort of maybe like the time of law. Then there's the time of the church, and that's sort of like the Son, and that's like the that's the time that he is occupied in, and they could know God through the church and through the hierarchy of the church and through the literary works. But he believed that there was going to be an ushering in of the age of the kingdom of the Holy Spirit, wherein the hierarchy of the church becomes obsolete. You have more of a spiritual understanding of God, and everyone is sort of more, God's message is sort of accessible to everyone in sort of a very direct way. And although he was thought of as, he wasn't a heretic in his own time, but his ideas, he presented them to the church and then died before they were done reviewing it. But they considered it to be a heresy. And so, but I think that this is kind of interesting and also coincides with this sort of tension between maybe a corrupt hierarchy in the church, and then people getting more information from about Aristotle, and people wanting to kind of get back to a simpler, more earnest pursuit of knowledge and God, etc.
Michael,
Yep.
you are doing awesome. This is amazing. Forgive me for waiting so long to call you up. I just want to register the fact, y'all, philosophy is hard. It's way harder than molecular biology. Way harder. Way harder. No comparison. It's really, really hard. Like all this whirlwind, this tour de force of topics that you're throwing out, all of which are amazing. It is so hard. And I want to say that one of the challenges is the discipline, and it takes an insane amount of discipline to focus, to like narrow your scope. Like, I can't talk about these 18 things. I got to talk about this one thing. It's really hard. You're doing awesome, but I need to give you a 5-minute warning.
Got it. Okay.
And what I would like to do is respond at the beginning of class on Monday.
Okay.
So, but it's amazing. Keep going. Sadly, I need to give you a 7-minute warning.
I'm almost done.
And okay.
So simply, yeah. So Joachim of Fiore, I think, is noteworthy because it addresses sort of the political landscape in which Francis of Assisi operated, as well as Bonaventure. Okay, so who's Francis of Assisi? So he starts the Franciscan order. He likes this austere living. He actually wants to be like Christ and be poor. Bonaventure thinks of him as something like a prophet, and really succeeded in becoming or living like Christ in a lot of ways, to the extent that he received a divine meeting with the seraph, similar to the seraph of Isaiah, and then there was a sort of a mark left upon him. This sort of it was a miracle that sort of indicated his Christ-likeness. But importantly, he had. So getting back to the theory on knowledge, he was able to, as an individual, not only have confirmation that he was on the right track in terms of his earnest pursuit of being Christ-like, but he was able to perhaps receive even more direct information from the angel, from the messenger. So I think in a lot of ways, Bonaventure's he did several things, but Bonaventure is trying to, or one of the main things he tried to do is understand and make sense of the life of Saint Francis. Francis lives the life. Bonaventure tries to understand the life, and then builds some sort of a theory afterwards. Here's the seraphim. It has like 6 wings, and they're made out of fire and stuff. Okay, so here's the divided line really quickly. We talked about it earlier. And then let's see here. So here's kind of I think this represents maybe the comparison or the connection between the two a little bit. You see the soul progresses. The soul progresses along its journey, contemplating God's reflection. So that's the vestiges, God's reflection. It's like, and this is similar to like the watchmaker's argument or something like this. But in other words, a design implies a designer. The natural faculties of the soul then see these same faculties, but they're reformed by grace. And so I think that's we have this innate hardware, but then God is, I think, directly involved in reforming our thought, etc. And this is provided you have the will to to engage in this. Then the soul turns to God himself and contemplates him as being, and this is getting to the mystery of being in itself. We can only, in this situation, get out of the cave, essentially. We can only exit the cave and understand the form of the good, or understand being in itself with the help of God and a lot of introspection and a lot of will. All these things result in the final stage of mystical ecstasy.
Thank you so much. That was so fun. But it's hard. But it's hard on the one hand. On the other hand, it's like crack cocaine. It's addictive. Like you get into it. It's super hard to figure out what did Bonaventure say about X. You know what? It's kind of like I'm a runner. I like to run. And I don't know how to. I once saw an ad in a running magazine that said the only thing worse than running is not running, which is so true. That's how I feel about philosophy. I mean, if it bites you, and you get the bug, and you're infected with the desire, and it is desire, a desire to figure stuff out. The only thing worse than philosophizing is not philosophizing. Next week, I think what we'll do next on Monday, is watch Michael's video, and I'll respond to Michael's video or presentation on Monday. Y'all, let me say this, and I probably don't need to say it, but I want to say it even just for the sake of conscientiousness. So you guys seem like you're in a good spot in terms of getting your paper done. I mean, like, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but you're on track. I don't think there's any reason. So the last reading assignment are some primary texts by Bonaventure. You don't need to read those. We'll just do the Cousins. You do need to read the Cousins introduction. But you don't need to read that stuff by Bonaventure. We're just running out of time. And that's fine. It's the nature of the beast. But we will start on Monday with me responding to Michael's presentation. And yeah, have a great weekend. Peace. I've graded about half of your paper.